This presentation will take you through the key features of the film posters and film marketing for Component 1 Section A. We will start with The Man with the Golden Gun and some of the key contextual information. It was released in 1974, starring Roger Moore. A £7 million budget, which doesn't sound much but was quite a big budget at the time, and grossed $74 million. This is a very, very successful film. There are several kung fu scenes in the film to reflect the growing popularity of this genre in the 1970s, filmed in Hong Kong, Thailand and Macau, and the artwork for the film poster produced by Robert McGuinness. Some of the social and historical context which is important for your understanding of the poster. Prior to the 1990s, illustrations were the most popular form of film poster due to limitations in technology, and this poster is very, very typical of its time. It is a film set in the middle of the 1973 energy crisis, an oil embargo, a commercial conflict between East and West, and we see lots of references to the energy crisis and the conflict between East and West in this poster. Culturally, the poster is typical of the time period in terms of its representation of gender. Whilst this isn't strictly a patriarchal society, it is one where gender equality is not where it is today, and therefore we see the female characters in a subservient role, very, very typical both of film at the time and in particular Bond at the time. I'm going to talk you through some of the codes and conventions of film posters and how they feed into our understanding of the meaning that comes out of the two posters. This is a list here of some of the conventions you might find, and I'll go through some of these in a bit more detail in subsequent slides. The first way we'll look at this is through layout and design. You might be asked in the exam, how do codes and conventions create meaning? And layout and design is one of the areas they may ask you to focus on. If they ask you to focus on layout, the most important thing to look at is the way in which the rule of thirds has been used. If we look at this poster here, we can clearly see that Bond, Roger Moore as Bond, has been placed in the centre third to draw attention to him. His eyes sit on one of the focus lines, so we are drawn to his intense masculine gaze. The two women are placed either side of Bond to reinforce their inferiority and their dependence upon him. It is a poster which is very, very busy with images, which is different to the film posters we might see today. We'll look at that when we see Spectre later on. But it was typical of posters of the time. The reason being that this was the primary source of marketing for the film. Unlike today, where we have year-long extensive marketing campaigns for blockbusters such as the Bond franchise, the marketing campaign is much, much more limited in 1974. And so the audience needs those action and enigma codes, those narrative clues in the poster that they might get from trailers and online marketing today. We see here almost as much focus on the actor's name as on the title of the film. Star appeal is important here. Roger Moore as an established Bond, one of the biggest actors of the 1970s. And so the poster is very much using Roger Moore's name and his association with Bond to sell the film. If we consider some of the images in the poster, the first one is the tuxedo and the gun. Now these symbols are very, very much part of the iconography of the franchise. You could take everything else away from this poster and you would still know that this was a Bond film. So the focus on those two symbols is important. The direct gaze of the protagonist forms a connection with the audience, but also the intensity of that gaze establishes him as a strong, dominant, masculine figure. We of course have the overly sexualized females, which are very typical of the time and in particular typical of Bond. Bond girls are a big sell for a film like this. There are lots and lots of images on here, and as discussed on the previous slide, that is because of the limitations in marketing. So much of the film's narrative has to be sold through the poster. The karate figure appealing to fans of the kung fu genre popular in the 1970s. So here we have a film tapping in to popular culture and reaching out to a broader audience worldwide. In terms of character, the poster very much conforms to Prop's character types. We have the clear indication of the hero in Roger Moore and Bond, signified by his size, his central position and his strong direct gaze. The princess, or the prize, is often one of the women, but also the goal in a Bond film, and Bond's goal is normally to defeat the villain or the criminal and to restore world peace. So those images round the outside are very much part of the prize. The helper is possibly the female karate character, but it's unclear. The false hero, the distraction, is likely one of the women, probably the one that is pointing at Bond. It's almost as if she is directing the gun at him. And the villain is quite clearly the hand holding the gun in the bottom right hand corner. The villain is unclear, which acts as an enigma code, a puzzle for the audience to solve, as opposed to the dark intent of the masculine figure. The karate kicking female does subvert the stereotype of the woman as being weak and inferior, but her skin tone suggests that she is of ethnic minority, conforming to the stereotype of the genre that the foreigner is something dangerous and to be feared. So even when we get a strong female character, she is presented as something other, something alien to this world in some way. In terms of theory, we might apply Laura Mulvey's male gaze theory here. Mulvey would argue that everything in the poster is constructed for the pleasure of the male gaze. The lighting draws the male eye to the curves and exposed flesh of the female, as I've previously said, and they are objectified for the viewing pleasure of the male. If we consider Stuart Hall's reception theory, Hall would argue that a 1970s audience would read this poster in a different way to a modern audience. A dominant reading of the 1970s might see the woman in the karate outfit as foreign, dangerous and aggressive, whereas a modern reader might see her as embodying the strength, power and rebellion of the modern woman. She might be seen by a modern audience as a much more progressive figure. Moving on to Spectre then. Spectre, released in October 2016, Daniel Craig's fourth Bond film. You can see how the budgets have increased significantly since the 1970s. $445 million, grossing $880 million. Another successful film. The poster designed by Empire Designs and released in September 2015 as part of a global marketing campaign. So the first thing to note is that this is a much, much longer marketing campaign than we would have seen in the 1970s. It starts more than a year before the release of the film. We'll follow a similar process to that which we did with The Man with the Golden Gun here, and look at the codes and conventions in the following forms. In terms of layout and design, again, the rule of thirds is important here. Bond is placed in the centre to signify his significance and importance. Notably, as compared with The Man with the Golden Gun, this is a much more minimalist design. And that links to the power of the franchise and the wider marketing campaign. Bond is so well established now as a franchise that we don't need the busy poster that we saw in 1974. The other reason for the minimalist design is that this is part of a much wider marketing campaign. The poster is no longer the primary source of attracting an audience. We'd have interviews, a number of different trailers shown in a number of different places and on a number of different platforms, and so the audience get their narrative clues, their action and enigma codes from a number of different sources, and so we don't need a poster which is full of different codes. There is less of a focus on the actor's name. Of course, Daniel Craig now in our multimedia society is a global name. He is so synonymous with Bond, we don't need his name on the poster. A minimalist title as compared with The Man with the Golden Gun, again, a much broader public awareness of this film and of the franchise as a whole. You'll note the darker colour palette as compared to The Man with the Golden Gun, much more typical of the sinister edge of the modern Bond films. They are much darker in their composition than in the 1970s. In terms of images, we have again Bond in the tuxedo with the gun, very much part of the iconography of the franchise. His direct gaze again forms a connection with the audience, and there is a strength and a dominance in it. His arms are folded across his chest, and on the one hand this is certainly a position of strength, but it might also be seen as a position of vulnerability. To fold our arms, body language experts would tell us that this is a person with something to hide. This might be a vulnerable Bond, and that would be much more typical of modern notions of masculinity. The flower on his lapel very much looks like a blood stain, and we'll look at that when we come to action and enigma codes later. And the skeleton figure in the background, very much an image of death. In terms of character, again, Daniel Craig here, Bond very much conforms to Prop's notion of the hero. He dominates the poster completely with his size, central position and direct gaze. The villain, we might think, is the skeleton figure in the background, but interestingly, if we watch the film, we'll know that actually this is Daniel Craig, this is Bond's costume from the opening sequence, and this brings in the interesting element of the modern Bond, the duality of the hero. Bond and action heroes as a whole have this darker side to them in modern films. They are less the pure, wholly good gentleman that we might have seen in the 1970s. This is part of the expectation of an audience in the modern world. They expect a darker twist to their modern heroes. If you think about Batman, Batman has become an increasingly dark and sinister figure as the films have progressed into the modern era. In terms of narrative, the flower on the lapel, which looks like blood, very much an enigma code, a suggestion of injury to Bond. The skeleton promises darkness and threat, but overall there are far fewer codes because this poster is part of a much wider and more progressive marketing campaign. In terms of representation of gender, the protagonist obviously conforms to the stereotype of the strong masculine hero. Again, his dress is businesslike, a symbol of power in a patriarchal society. Like Roger Moore, the gaze is full of intensity and aggression, hinting at the dominance of the male protagonist. The gun across his chest adds an element of mystery which is typical, but as we've said before, the arms folded might be a sign of the vulnerability which is more than acceptable to a modern audience and in the modern man. In terms of femininity, the poster is completely devoid of a female presence. You might argue that is a progressive message. They've taken away the overly sexualised Bond girl from the 1970s. But more importantly, as this is part of a wider marketing campaign, there are more posters produced with female characters. As you will see, they are more businesslike, more professional, more elegant than the overly sexualised women that you might see in the 1970s. One further theory we might consider is Levi Strauss's theory of binary oppositions. Identifying the oppositions is one thing, but it's how those oppositions are structured which is important in creating meaning. Here we have the black versus white colour palette, a suggestion of a binary between good and evil. But what is important is that the good, the white of Bond, is in the foreground, and that means that good is prioritised over evil. What's important about that is that it then acts as a narrative code. It tells us that good will prevail over evil in the end.